Today I want to talk to you about prayer. I preached about prayer a couple weeks ago, and I got some questions that came in that I wanted to take the time to answer today. One of those questions is this. If God hears me crying out for years, then why do we still suffer with pain? And if God hears us crying out, why do we still have pain and suffering? And the other one was this. I was wondering if you could teach about the name it and claim it idea that teaches once you pray for something, you need to just believe and let it go. Just once you pray, you got to pray in faith and then just believe and let it go. So I want to talk about both of those today. The first one is that I want to talk about is if God hears us and we keep crying out, if God hears us, then why is there still pain and suffering? Okay, this is a really hard one, right? Because we believe that God hears us and we believe that God gives good gifts to his children. So what about those circumstances? What about those times when it seems like God doesn't answer us the way we wanted? And to help illustrate this, I want to use the story of Paul in the New Testament. There was a time in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 that Paul says that he prayed. Verse 8 says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take this away from me, but he said, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. There was 3 times. Paul had a thorn in his flesh. He was plagued. He was bothered by an issue, and he went to God over and over again and asked God to take it away from him. And God didn't answer. And so he pleaded, and God didn't answer, and he pleaded, and God didn't answer. And at the end of all of these prayers, in this specific circumstance, God's answer ended up being, what difference is it if I take it away? Maybe I'm not going to take it away. You know what? I need you to know that my grace is sufficient in your weakness. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. I've known a lot of people that went through things that none of us would want to go through. And the things they went through were not smooth. As a pastor, you get to pray with people in really hard times. Well, there's a lady in our church, Dottie, and she spent months and months in rehab. She went in for surgery and it didn't go well. Her recovery was really hard. She spent months and months and months in rehab. She was in a coma a couple times, unexpected emergency surgeries. And at the end of that, she basically said that she would have gone through it again because it was in that hard time that she met the Lord, that she discovered him in a deeper way, in a more powerful way than she ever knew him. And here's what I can tell you. Every one of us want to pray that God would answer our prayers the way we want them to be answered. But if God doesn't answer the prayer the way you want him to answer that prayer, this is what I can promise you. His grace is sufficient. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. It's only in a place of weakness that we can discover the full strength of his power. So if you're in that place where you feel like God is not answering your prayers, I want you to know that you are on a pathway to intimacy with God, to discover what real dependence on him looks like. And the people that I know that have come out the other side of that and not lost faith, they didn't give up on God, they pressed in to meet him through that trial, are the people with the greatest faith that I know. And so if you're in that place, don't quit, don't give up. You're about to experience God in a way that so many people never have had the ability to. So stick with it. Keep praying. Now, to the person that asked, all right, I've heard that I'm supposed to pray in faith and then just believe that it's done and walk in it and stop praying. I love that idea. But if you're not careful with that idea, then what happens is we end up having faith in our prayer instead of in the one we're praying to. What do I mean by that? We don't want to have faith in ourself. We don't want to have faith in our prayer that we prayed it right, that we did everything right, that now God is going to answer that. No, our prayer isn't in our faith is not in ourselves. Our faith is not in our prayer request. We don't want to trust in ourselves. Our faith is in the request granter. Our faith is in God. And when we look through Scripture, so often He says to pray without ceasing, to ask and keep asking. In last week or a couple weeks ago, we looked at this parable in Luke chapter 18 of the persistent widow. And in Luke 18, God teaches us that we should bother Him in prayer in verse 5, and that we should cry out to Him day and night, verse 7. Verse 5 also says, wear Him out in prayer. So we should pray with such persistence that we wear Him out. Now, what happens when we're praying? In Paul's case, God answered that, and He said, my grace is sufficient in your weakness. When we've been praying and praying and praying, and God hasn't answered, we keep praying. Okay, until God answers that. Once God answers that, then we know how to respond. We don't want to refuse His answers. Now, if you keep praying and refuse His answer, in one sense, well, you can keep pleading. But in another sense, what you're going to do is you're going to start disobeying. If God answers you, and you feel like you've received an answer from God, now what we're called to do is to, instead of continue to pray the previous prayer, we're called to walk in obedience with His answer to prayer. And so once God answers a prayer, then you have to respond accordingly. But until God answers a prayer, I believe we're called to keep praying. Don't just stop praying because you prayed once. No. Attack heaven's gates in prayer. Continue to pray and believe. And continued prayer is actually, to me, continued prayer is exhibiting more faith than somebody that prays and stops. Why? Because if you pray and you don't receive, but you continue to pray, you're saying, I believe, even though He hasn't answered, I still believe He could answer. I still believe He might answer. I still believe He will answer. So continued prayer is actually proof of faith, because what you're saying is, even though I haven't gotten my answer yet, I'm going to keep praying. Why? Because I believe in my God. Okay, those are a couple thoughts about prayer for some questions that I got. If you have some more questions about prayer, maybe those answers weren't in detail enough for you, go ahead and comment below. I'd be happy to try to answer them in next month's blog. Next week's blog. It's been such a busy summer. I've hardly gotten a chance to do these kinds of video blogs. It seems like every week I've either had a wedding or a funeral on top of camp and VBS and all these different kinds of things. But, I'm hoping my summer's actually about to start. And hopefully I'll have some time to do some more of these videos. So if you have some questions, I'd love to answer those below. So comment below, and we could take this subject a little bit further. God bless you, and keep growing in your faith. Keep reading the Word every day and see what you get out of it. If you're local, hey, I'd love to see you Sunday morning at Living Proof Church, 9 a.m. and 10:45. God bless you, and keep growing.